There are lots of authoritarian elections, so there's lots to talk about. And we have 5 fantastic panelists. So thank you all for coming out for this panel on what's up with authoritarian elections, pardon the very formal title. I'm Dan Slater, I'm director of the Weiser Center of Emerging Democracies, and let me just briefly introduce the panel participants and let them each speak for about 10 minutes or so about their research on what is indeed up with authoritarian elections. So first of all, we have Alberto Simpser. He's Associate Professor of Political Science at ITAM in Mexico City, and he's the author of Why Governments and Parties Manipulate Elections, which is in Cambridge, 2013. Prior to joining ITAM in 2014, he served on the faculty of the University of Chicago's Political Science Department as assistant professor, which is where Alberto and I were in the same department and served together. When you talk about serving at the University of Chicago, it's like tours of duty. It's like, you know, being in Afghanistan or something. Like, oh yeah, I served a tour. Oh yeah, so we were in the same company there. Henrik Knutsen is also with us. He's professor of political science at the University of Oslo and the research group leader for the Comparative Institutions and Regimes group at the same department. He also holds a secondary position as senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, PRIO, and is co-PI of the Rise of Democracy, or VDEM project. He's also a member, this is my favorite feature, he's also a member of the Norwegian Young Academy. So I'm curious, can you get a lifetime appointment to the Young Academy? Like, do you, that sounds great. Like, you should be, you know.
It's 4 years and you're out.
4 years and you're out. You're no longer young. You age out of the Norwegian Young Academy. Okay. Moving on, many people. Masaaki Higashijima is Associate Professor of Political Science at Tohoku University in Japan. He's a visiting research scholar in the Center for Political Studies here at the U of M now. And before arriving in Tohoku, he was a postdoctoral Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute and an assistant professor at Waseda University in Tokyo. Our final participant in terms of being a presenter is Erica Frantz from nearby. She's assistant professor in political science at Michigan State University, and she has published not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 books on dictatorships and development, including the brand new Cambridge book, How Dictatorships Work, with Barbara Geddes and Joseph Wright. And finally, Alan Hicken, our very own Alan Hicken. In fact, I'm going to propose tonight that we officially change Alan's legal name to our very own Alan Hicken. Without objection, so ordered. Alan is professor of political science here at Michigan, and he is the author of Building Party Systems in Developing Democracies, which was published by Cambridge in 2009. So Alan will be serving as moderator, but then we're going to go in alphabetical order, again, about 10 minutes each, and look forward to your comments. And thanks again for coming.
All right, thank you, Dan, and to everyone at Michigan for hosting us today. So, what's up with authoritarian elections? I love the title of this panel. I'm going to discuss some kind of broad trends in terms of authoritarian elections, and then give you a couple of findings from a book that I have that came out last year called How Dictatorships Work with Barbara Geddes and Joseph Wright. So specifically, I'm going to show some evidence of why it is that we're seeing more competitive elections in dictatorships, as well as what the purpose is of elections of all sorts in dictatorships, and what some of the consequences are of these races. And just to start things out, I'll use the term dictatorships, authoritarian, autocratic interchangeably here. Okay, so as you might imagine, elections occur all the time. In any given year, 1 out of 4 countries will hold an election, okay? And that's including elections that are democratic as well. So these are really common events. They're also pretty expensive events, which I'll return to in a second. And they have varying stakes in terms of, what the risks are in these races. So we typically associate elections with democracy. But they occur in dictatorships too, hence the whole purpose of this panel. And today, my general sense is that most scholars, at least, are aware that dictatorships regularly hold elections, that this is something that's not uncommon. Perhaps it's less frequently observed, at least, that elections have always been somewhat common in dictatorships. It's not just a consequence of the end of the Cold War and what happened. That said, what has changed over time in terms of Cold War versus post-Cold War is the competitiveness of these races. So in the 1960s, about half of all dictatorships held elections on a somewhat regular basis with multiple political parties. That number might actually be higher than what you thought it was. But it turns out if we look at the data, about half of all dictatorships had these semi-competitive elections where multiple parties could compete, more than one name on the ballot, and so forth. By the 2000s, that number increased to about 75%, and it has since gone up. So that really means that most dictatorships today hold semi-competitive elections. This has really become the norm rather than some sort of outlier. In terms of what's going on, if you look at a graph of foreign aid and whether a country has semi-competitive elections, we can see some interesting trends, particularly that since the end of the Cold War, those countries that held more competitive elections received more aid. So that correlation there can give us some insight into why it is that more dictatorships are holding semi-competitive elections. It looks like there is some influence of international donors. And that's actually consistent with a lot of case studies that have identified that changing donor behaviors have really influenced whether dictatorships want to allow competition. Okay, so these geopolitical changes can help us understand why we see so many semi-competitive elections, and that's not the only factor, but one that seems to resonate. But that doesn't really give us that much insight into why it is that dictatorships were holding elections that didn't have competition in the first place. And it's somewhat perplexing if you think about during the Cold War, we had all of these communist regimes and dominant party dictatorships that would hold these elections with one candidate on the ballot. Like, what is the point of that? It seems like a somewhat meaningless exercise, particularly because it's not free to hold an election, right? No election is cost-free. You have to pay for these things to happen. Okay. So in our research, we emphasize two main points that get at why it is that we think that dictatorships are holding elections. And one of these points emphasizes elections that are happening at the executive level, and the other one emphasizes legislative and local elections. And I should add, as the person that was going to give you some broad insights, that there is quite a bit of evidence that dictatorships that hold elections last longer than those that don't. There are debates in the literature about the causal pathways here, but regardless, we know that these places that hold these elections are more durable or more long-lasting than those that don't. So something must be going on here, right, to see these types of trends. Okay, so I'm going to start with what we think might be happening with presidential elections. And here you have sometimes a single person on the ballot, just the dictator, and other times the dictator is running against somebody else. Regardless, executive elections are different than legislative elections because sometimes the regime loses at the legislative or local level. Occasionally they lose at the executive level too, but it's not as common, right? Whereas some of these legislative losses do occur at the more localized level. Okay, so at the executive level, we think that these presidential elections are this costly signal of the dictator's strength. So the dictator is sending a message to potential rivals, both within the ruling coalition and within the opposition elite, that look what I can do. I can mobilize all these voters. I can get them to show up to the polls. Don't try to challenge me because I actually have supporters. And I said costly signal of strength because these things are expensive affairs. And I'll show some evidence about that in a second. So dictators use a lot of different tactics that I'm not going to get into to ensure that they win these races, but the goal is to mobilize supporters, have high turnout, and really put on this display that you are popular or have support. As an indicator that these are efforts, these executive elections are efforts to signal strength, it turns out if you postpone executive elections, that's a bad idea. So watchful eyes see this as an indicator of vulnerability. And if we look at the data, irregular elections, so those that where the original date was changed, are twice as likely to be followed by regime collapse as regular elections. And leaders that are presiding over these irregular elections are twice as likely to be killed, imprisoned, or exiled upon their exit from power. So you don't want to postpone the election. That's the big message. But really, this is because postponing it signals some sort of vulnerability or weakness. It arouses suspicions as to what's going on. In terms of the legislative elections and other local elections, we think that these elections serve as tools for the regime to gather information about what's going on within it. So you have all of these races where members of the party, let's say, are competing for the nomination. And they're going to have to engage in efforts to prove that they deserve that nomination. Those efforts might entail strengthening some of their patron-client ties. They might entail distributing some goods to some of their supporters. There's a wide range of activities that these local officials might engage in, but they're all geared toward making sure that they get the nomination, or if they are on the ballot and there's another candidate up there, that they win the race. So we think that these types of activities provide the regime elites with some information about who's loyal, which officials are loyal to the regime and which aren't. Okay. So for ordinary people, there are a lot of perks that can be associated with this. A colleague of mine has shown that calorie consumption around the time of Egyptian elections was higher. I found that mind-blowing, but that is really an indicator of what's going on, that people were eating more in Egypt at election time because the regime was distributing, I think it was more bread. Okay. And in our study, we show that government spending is indeed higher in election years than it is otherwise, and this is consistent with the literature on political business cycles. Interestingly, we find that the spending is higher regardless of the level of competition of the election. So even uncompetitive elections are associated with greater spending, which we see as an indicator that these are really efforts for local officials to prove their worth, whether it be in the nomination process or in the contest itself. Okay, I mentioned that citizens are getting some positives of these races. In the case of Egypt, a little bit more food. But we show that these little positives accumulate to better welfare outcomes for ordinary people. In that dictatorships that hold these elections, that hold semi-competitive elections as well, there's less support for uncompetitive elections, but still there is some support. These places tend to have higher healthcare spending and lower infant mortality rates, which are both indicators of overall well-being. So these activities that are geared towards cultivating support at the local level accumulate into a situation where aggregate healthcare spending is higher and where infant mortality rates are lower. Okay, so those are some of the big takeaways that I wanted to get at. I'm going to point out two different areas where I think that they're potential avenues for future research. So I don't think we have a very good sense of which elections in particular are going to be destabilizing. And Malaysia, I'm not an expert on Malaysia, we have some here, is a good example. 2018, I for one was not expecting what happened. The Gambia is another example from recent years where this long-standing autocrat lost the election, and he didn't leave immediately, but he eventually did leave as a result of that contest. So why is it that in some instances we actually do see regime change because of an election result? That's one area for future research that I think is interesting. And then the other one that I wish we knew more about has to do with the conditions under which we see these efforts at reform. So you could say that allowing multiple parties on a ballot is an effort towards reform. So when are those efforts actually genuine signs of political liberalization? And when are they actual signs of a regime that is smart and trying to hold on to power for longer? And the classic example to me of this comes from Myanmar, where the regime, the military junta, engaged in a number of liberalization reforms around 2010, 2011 or so. And the media made a big deal about this, as did the international community, where suddenly it was no longer this pariah state and people were willing to go have official talks with the government there. And some people saw this as a genuine sign of reform. Maybe I'm a pessimist. I saw this as a strategic way of holding on to power for longer. So ideally, it would be nice to better understand the conditions under which one is a indicator of liberalization rather than just a smart dictator engaging in moves to fool us all. All right, I'm going to close with that.
It takes some time. Okay, here we go. Thank you very much, Dan, for the kind introduction. And thank you also, I really appreciate for having me here, and I'm honored to be here to present the working project I'm now working on for a book project. Actually this book manuscript has been workshopped today with those members, and I got tons of comments that I have to reflect for the next manuscript. But let me just briefly introduce my book project here. So the book project is about is titled "The Dictator's Dilemma at the Ballot Box: Electoral Manipulation, Economic Maneuvering, and Political Order in Dictatorships in Autocracy." And in this book project, I'm going to explore the manners in which autocrats design elections and consequences of those elections on political order, post-electoral political order. And I have two specific big questions in this book project. The first question is, when do dictators manipulate election results through blatant electoral fraud and the manipulation of electoral systems? And the second one is the consequences, political consequences of autocratic elections. That is, when do autocrats lead to destabilizing authoritarian rule through coup d'etat or democratic transitions or protests? And in this book project, I'm combining cross-national statistical analysis with controlled comparisons of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. And looking at some cross-national data, so this is, so here we see variation in the extent of electoral fraud in 3 different categories. And the y-axis represents the extent of blatant electoral fraud, which includes many subcomponents of blatant electoral fraud, like the registering opposition parties, or non-violent and violent intimidation toward opposition parties and supporters, and just like simply stuffing at the ballot box, or media bias during election period. So aggregating those different components of electoral fraud into one latent measure, electoral fraud, you can see that in advanced democracies, there is no, most elections are free and fair. So there is no such things as electoral fraud. And in non-Western democracies in which the free and fair elections has not been the norm among people and political actors, so there is much variation in the extent of electoral fraud. But interestingly, we can also see the large variation in blatant electoral fraud in dictatorships. And we tend to think that dictatorships, almost all of dictatorships have tried to manipulate elections. But we can see that there is rich variation. So this is what I try to explain in this book project. And also, in addition to blatant electoral fraud, we can also see variation in the types of electoral systems in dictatorships. So here the sample is electoral authoritarian regimes where dictators hold elections where opposition parties are allowed to participate. And so here I'm using a continuous measure of electoral system types, that is effective electoral threshold. And the idea is that if if EET is high, then electoral systems is close to single-member district systems. And if this measure is gets lower, then the electoral systems gets more like proportional representation systems. And we may be able to think that because in dictatorships only ruling parties have really very strong, so that it's natural for dictators to adapt SMD systems to bias election results in favor of ruling parties. But still, we can see which variation in the extent of EET. So for example, in Asia, many countries tend to adapt SMD systems. But for example, in Latin America, more countries tend to adapt more proportional representation systems. So in terms of electoral systems, we can see differences across dictatorships. So in order to explain those differences, I try to build some theoretical framework to understand the design of elections in dictatorships. And I'm focusing on a dilemma that dictators are facing at the ballot box. So on the one hand, electoral manipulation may undermine credibility of election results, which may damage the beneficial effects of holding elections in dictatorships. So as Erika pointed out, the elections provide several benefits, like, for example, by scoring overwhelming majority, then regimes may be able to signal their regime strengths. Or by holding semi-competitive elections, dictators may be able to gather information about the distribution of support for opposition parties as well as ruling parties. So if you have relatively free and fair elections, in the sense that elections are relatively free from blatant electoral fraud and also institutional manipulation, then dictators can exploit those benefits. But on the other hand, if you have excessively free and fair elections, then it decreases the probability that dictators win elections overwhelmingly, and which may be having negative impact on political order, because failure to winning with large margin may signal that the regime is very weak. So here I call this trade-off between certainty of winning big and the credibility of election results as the electoral dilemma in this book. And my argument is quite straightforward. That is, autocrats who can mobilize public support by non-cohesive measures, like typically providing economic favors like patronage and pork to citizens, becomes less rely on electoral manipulation, like the adoption of SMD systems or blatant electoral fraud. So here, if dictator can mobilize public support, then they are more likely to gear toward economic maneuvering, and then so that they don't need to rely on electoral manipulation, like the little blatant electoral fraud and the adoption of majoritarian systems. And if their mobilization capability is low, then they have to use majoritarian electoral systems to bias election results in favor of ruling parties in terms of seat spots gaps, and also they have to use blatant electoral fraud. So based on this theoretical framework, I tested my empirical implications on cross-national statistical analysis and comparative case studies of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. And I have, broadly, I have 4 findings. So the first finding may be a little bit counterintuitive, but resource-rich dictators who have rich oil resources are less likely to rely on fraud and majoritarian electoral systems. For example, in the case of Kazakhstan, during the 1990s, the dictator had adopted SMD systems, which really produced large seat premiums to ruling parties. And also, he adopted really extensive electoral fraud, which contributed to winning elections big. But after oil price increases during mid-2000s, the president could use economic resources to buy off citizen support. So he became less dependent on blatant electoral fraud, and also in 2007, he shifted the country's electoral systems from SMD to PR. And the second finding is that when oil meets organizations that streamline goods provision to the masses, then electoral manipulation is further reduced. So even if you have oil resources, there is no guarantee that you can distribute that oil resources to the masses in efficient way. So you have to have some kind of political organizations that could guarantee other ruling elites to provide goods to their supporters. And for example, if you have, what I found in cross-national analysis is that if you have strong dominant party regimes, then when you have oil, then you can see less blatant electoral fraud compared to the countries where oil is abundant but without dominant party systems. And the third finding is when the opposition is strong, then autocrats are less likely to score overwhelming majority in legislature or score winning big at presidential elections. So autocrats are more likely to employ electoral manipulation. And the fourth finding is that if my theory is correct, then there should be a correlation between the size of political business cycles, pre-electoral economic distribution, and less manipulated autocratic elections. And I tested this prediction based upon cross-national data and case studies. And regarding the second question that I asked in this book, that is when elections backfire on dictators, I argue that when dictators fail to deal with the dilemma, in elections, then elections may be backfiring on dictators. So if dictators oversupply electoral manipulation in light of their mobilization capabilities, then the opposition becomes can use that fact, oversupply of election fraud, to organize protest movements. So soon after elections, popular protests are more likely to occur. That is one scenario where elections may backfire on dictators. And the second one is the scenario where the autocrats fail to provide adequate amount of electoral manipulation. So if dictators undersupply electoral manipulation in light of their mobilization capabilities, then they may fail to win elections overwhelmingly, or even see stunning opposition's election victory, or after observing the election results, ruling elites may defect and also launch coup d'etat after elections. And the cross-national analysis suggests that if you undersupply electoral fraud, then the probability of leadership turnover through, opposition victory or coup d'etat is more likely to occur. And if you oversupply electoral fraud, then it sparks popular protests. So what could I say based upon these empirical findings? The first one is that it's likely that dictators, of course, strategically institutionalize or design elections. So if dictators are really strong enough to mobilize, public support through non-coercive measures, then, dictators can hold free and fair elections, right? Compared to the scenario where dictators are very weak. So this may suggest that elections free from electoral manipulation may not be a signal that the country is democratizing. So because dictators can decide the level of electoral manipulation for their own sake. So just looking at the level of electoral manipulation may not be enough to, to predict whether or not that country is democratizing. And this insight may be providing some implication for how to provide international support for democratization. So one of the implications may be that international support for improving electoral integrity may need to go hand in hand with other dimensions of assistance, international assistance. So just, providing, delivering election monitoring, election monitoring may not be enough to increase the likelihood of democratization. For example, by increasing transparency of economic policy making or transparency of state budgeting, then international society may be able to constrain dictators from using oil resources or expansionary fiscal policies in order to win big at the elections, so that the elections may become a chance for people in autocratic countries to achieve democratization. So, and this is what I can say from my book project, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks. So first of all, very happy to be here. So now comes the jet-lagged European. I was going to talk about. Luckily for me, even though I'm jet-lagged, I have a very simple point with this presentation. So even though I'm standing here almost sleeping, I should be able to get this point across. and the point is the following: authoritarian elections, or autocratic elections, if you like, tend to be destabilizing to the regimes they occur in the short term. So around election years, you should, when you see an election, you should expect that the probability that an autocratic regime will collapse will be higher. Then all these positive points that Erika, for example, talked about, all these functions of autocratic elections start to kick in and dominate. So over the long term, they are stabilizing. So the one takeaway point is that in the short term, these elections are destabilizing, but they may be stabilizing in the longer term. So I'm a little bit less certain about this long-term effect, but I'm going to get back to the nitty-gritty. So basically, this talk it's based on a paper, but the background for writing this paper together with two of my co-authors in Oslo was this debate going back and forth on whether or not elections in, sorry, again, the jet-lagged European walks across the room. So the point of departure is this debate that's been in the literature for quite a few years on different mechanisms pointing in different directions as to whether or not these elections are good or bad for autocratic stability. So do they help stabilize autocratic regimes, for example, because the regime might learn something about where the opposition is located? It might give them some legitimacy that they can draw benefits from in the international arena. But also we tend to see that whenever there's an election, there are more often protests, there are more often coups coming right after elections. So it's really not clear theoretically whether or not we should expect them to be stabilizing or destabilizing. The same thing with existing empirical studies. Mixed results, very weak results. So this is the point of departure, this big debate. The paper that I'm going to talk about is already published, so it's an old paper. By now, everything is relative, but 2017 with Håvard Nygaard and Tore Vig. And basically, again, this one question. Are these elections stabilizing or a force for change, destabilizing? So we're not terribly creative in this paper. What we're doing is we're going through these arguments that are already out there, and we're making one key observation. So we're listing these arguments and looking at what previous authors have said. What seems to characterize the arguments pointing towards elections being destabilizing is that they focus on the very short term. So they're focusing on events around election day or right before the election, right after the election. For example, when protesters gather to protest electoral fraud and things spiral out of control, or there's a coup d'etat, maybe because the generals learn that the current leader is less popular than expected when he or she only wins with, let's say, 20 percentage points and not the expected 70, right? So there are all these arguments pointing to things happening right around election time. Whereas the more stabilizing, the arguments pointing towards a stabilizing effect, either the building up of legitimacy, gathering information about opposition strongholds, these are things that you would expect to linger on. So you would expect that if the election brings these stabilizing effects, it wouldn't be exhausted after a few months. It should hold for quite some time. So basically what we're doing is that we're classifying these arguments, making this observation, and then we're running a large number of different tests to see to look at the structure of this temporal pattern, the temporal structure of this effect from elections on the probability of regime breakdown. And of course, there's one tricky issue. That's, of course, if you want to be smart in a political science seminar, that's the one comment you always should make. Well, isn't elections endogenous? Right? That's isn't the independent variable that you're trying to use as an explanation to explain the dependent variable? Isn't that really something that could be affected by your dependent variable? And that's definitely the case here. Because if these autocrats are rational, or at least have some idea that these elections have either stabilizing or destabilizing effect, then they should be strategic as to when they would hold elections. So if I anticipate that elections are going to be really, really destabilizing, I might not hold them at all if I'm the dictator. Right, so we have all these tricky issues that we're trying to deal with in the paper. I won't get into it now, but basically just go through what our expectation is. So this is my not so very pretty drawing about what we expect theoretically. So the benchmark here, let's call it a non-electoral regime. So this is pure theory. So let's assume that we have two completely identical autocratic regimes. Oops. Yeah. So they're completely identical, except that one does not hold elections, and the other one decides to hold elections at this point in time t. So, and on the y-axis here is the probability of breaking down at any given point in time for the regime. So for the regime not holding elections, we expect some modest probability of breaking down. So let's say that this is 2% a year or something like that. So every 2 out of 100 years, the regime expects to break down. Whereas for the other one, that's identical, except it decides to hold an election. We anticipate that we have all these destabilizing short-term effects. So in the short term, you would expect a higher probability of the regime breaking down. But then, after the election year has passed and things have settled down, then all these positive, for the autocrat that is, effects of elections start accumulating. And you have a lower baseline probability of breaking down than in the counterfactual setting where you did not have elections. So basically, you're learning things about the opposition, you have some extra legitimacy. So if you survive the first year, then you're better off. That's our expectation. Then we used the data by Erika and Barbara Geddes and Joe Wright on autocratic regimes. We used the Heidemarino-Nelda data on elections, so there are data on elections. We have data from 1946 to 2008 on autocracies around the world. And we try to model this time argument in different ways. I'm not going to go into the technical details, but we're using more complex ways of modeling it and very simple things such as dummy for an election year. So is there an election year or are we like 2 to 5 years removed from an election? And then we basically just do a lot of statistical tests. And one thing is very clear from the tests that we do, and that seems to be this destabilizing short-term effect. So there seems to be evidence both for the destabilizing short-term effect and the stabilizing long-term effect. But if I were to bet my house on any one of the two, it would be the short-term effect. It's much more robust. So it's a really, really clear finding. So I'd be willing to bet my house on that. So this is a so-called GAM, Generalized Additive model, where we basically let the data decide the structure of we're not giving any clear functional form as to how elections affect the probability of breakdown over time. And we're basically able to recreate much of the theoretical expectation. So again, there's one point that I've been trying to convey with this talk, and it's the fact that autocratic elections are destabilizing in the short term. And since there is a little more uncertainty around the long-term stabilizing effect, I've put on a may here. So it may be stabilizing in the long term. So thanks.
Hi, it's my turn. This is the last 10-minute intervention we will be inflicting on you today. I'm waiting for, here are my slides. So I'm going to, I have worked on authoritarian elections also for a long time. I have focused on particular aspects of them, and that's what I want to do now. I want to compare one dimension of those elections to the same dimension in democratic elections. And that dimension is the use of election fraud, manipulation, whatever you want to call it. And so I want to start with the typical view, or what the intuitive view of election manipulation. And you know, there has been a case of election fraud in the US recently in the news, right? And that's a typical case. The number of ballots that were manipulated, that were fraudulently altered, is pretty small. The margin of victory in the election is pretty small. So it stands to reason that if somebody's going to take the risk of manipulating an election, they'll do it when they think that doing so is going to lead them to win when they would otherwise have lost. That's what makes sense. That's true in democratic elections. It is not always true in authoritarian elections. In fact, when we look around, we look at authoritarian elections, many of them, most of them, are won with very large margins of victory. So a very large margin of victory in the United States or in a typical Western or country or democratic country is 10%, right? So the Obama victory was a landslide, right? That was a landslide. But we have in recent experience, Bush v. Gore was basically tied. Trump lost by 3 million votes. These are small margins of victory. That's typical. If you go to authoritarian elections, you begin to see things like Vladimir Putin winning with a 40% margin of victory, or in Kazakhstan, a 90+ % margin of victory, things like that. That's 90% difference between the winner and the next runner-up, right? In the United States, in Europe, this is inconceivable. Why do authoritarian elections look this way? Why do they? The other thing is that these margins of victory are very often coupled with very extensive manipulation. Why is this? Why would you invest so much effort? Why would you overinvest in manipulating an election? In fact, in many cases, we know that the incumbent would win without manipulation, or we can surmise that on the basis of polls, popularity, whatever. They still go on to manipulate very extensively, much more than the case in South Carolina that we had in the United States. Why is that? That's basically the question that one of the questions that my work has dealt with, and the answer is that the logic of manipulation in authoritarian elections is not the same as the logic of manipulation in democratic elections. Sometimes it is. Sometimes autocrats find themselves in a situation where they are in a highly competitive election and they have to hang on by I forget what the idiom is. By a thread? No, by the nails, right? By the whatever. They have to hang on. And they have to win and they have to manipulate just to get over the hump, from 49 to 51 or whatever. But more often, they're not in that situation, and they manipulate anyway. Why? Well, the answer is related to what Erica was saying. They want to show that they are strong. In contrast with some of the literature, though, I would emphasize that a very important point is to understand what is meant by they are strong. In general, they're not trying to show that they're popular. Sometimes they are popular, but everybody knows they manipulated and they won by a lot more than they would have had they run a fair election. Other times people know that they're unpopular and they win because they manipulated. Generally speaking, it's very difficult to manipulate an election and win with 90% of the vote and have nobody know that you manipulated the election. Right, so some of the tactics that autocrats use are vote buying and intimidation. These are in wide use. Voters learn when votes are being bought and when people are being intimidated. So there's no one to fool. My argument would be that manipulating to win big does not show that the autocrat is popular, nor is it intended to. It's intended to show that the autocrat is in charge and that the autocrat will be in power tomorrow. And that's the disciplining device. You can think of a wide variety of political actors. You can think of of opposition parties. You can think of talented politicians. Where would you rather be? In a party that's going to lose elections over the next 10 years, or in the ruling party where you're not going to be the first in command, but you are going to be in power? And we see routinely in these elections that there is, when we're able to observe autocratic power consolidate, there's an exodus of politicians from opposition parties to the ruling party. We can see this very clearly in Russia, for example, where we have that timeline is very recent. Putin began consolidating authoritarianism in the year 2000 when he got into power, and we saw even the heads of democratizing Russian parties move to work for him in the incumbent party. Who else is disciplined? Bureaucrats. Bureaucrats have to implement your policies. Well, they can dilly-dally, they can divert resources, they can do many things. There's principal-agent problems all down the chain. Well, if a bureaucrat knows you will be in charge tomorrow, they're much more likely to be disciplined and to do your bidding than if they think you may not be in charge tomorrow and they dislike you. Same thing with voters. Voters, in authoritarian elections, they are very often apathetic. They don't have an inner motivation to go and vote. Sometimes we have very high levels of turnout, but that's because either of coercion or vote buying. But it's not because they're highly motivated to go and vote. If what motivates you to go and vote is to express enthusiasm, then why would you be motivated if you don't like the incumbent? If what motivates you to go and vote is to change the outcome of the election, then again, why would you be motivated to go and vote? So, and opposition parties, so anyway, to sum up, in my work, I have argued that, I have documented that there is this pattern of very high margins of victory in highly manipulated elections. The question is why? And the short answer is that rulers want to show who is in charge. Let me show you, just to close, a very interesting set of graphs. This is what normal elections look like. So this is a histogram. This is basically a frequency, a description of the frequency. Well, I'm going to try something. I hope it works. Yeah, it works. Essentially, what am I showing you here? So these are different elections. For example, this is a Swedish election. And what's on the x-axis? So this is, I'm showing you precincts, okay? So this tells me that in Sweden, in this election, in most precincts, about 85% of registered voters showed up to vote, okay? This is a graph of distribution of turnout. In very few precincts, less than 50% of the voters showed up to vote, of the registered voters, okay? And in a few precincts, more than 90% showed up to vote. This is an election in Mexico, this one right here. Again, we have this normal bell-shaped curve. This is the average turnout, say 60%. In very few precincts, you have many people, almost everybody showing to vote. In very, very few precincts, you have very few people showing up to vote. This is the way, these are elections in different countries that look normal. Now I'm going to show you what they look like in Putin's Russia. So what's the difference here between this distribution and this kind of distribution? This is 4 different elections in Russia. So again, if you look from here to the left, they look normal, right? They look like a bell-shaped distribution. If you look from here to the right, they look very different. What are the differences? Well, one very, very curious fact are these little peaks over here. There's a peak right here on 80%. There's a peak on 90%. There's a huge peak on 100%. How could it be that there's an outsized number of precincts where exactly 80% of registered voters turned out to vote? An outsized number of precincts where exactly 85% turn out to vote, exactly 90%, and so on. So these peaks are hard to reconcile with any natural process. It turns out the head of the Electoral Commission, who's a highly educated man, I think has a doctorate in computer science, came out and said that this is not the product, when confronted with this, that this is not the product of manipulation, but it's the product of the fact that in rural areas, there are very small precincts. So when you have, say, 10 registered voters, you could easily get 8 voters showing up. That would be exactly 80%. Turns out that's probably not true. Now, this kind of graph has been used for several purposes. The first is analytical. So if you estimate the correct normal curve here, you can simply assume that all of these votes are added, right? This is ballot stuffing, essentially. So that's one way to estimate how many votes have been manufactured in Russian elections. The second and maybe even more interesting use is that these kinds of graphs that were originally produced by a Russian physicist in 2011 went viral. They went mainstream. And so you had protests on the street where people were printing these graphs and they had them in their signs protesting against the election. So anyway, this is the kind of thing that an authoritarian election looks like. It's manipulation to win, not to win, but actually to win with a 90%, to win with 100%. Anyway, that's what I have for you today.
Okay, we've had a great sort of warm-up with all four of our panelists. We'll just throw it open to the floor. We've got a microphone, so if you'll wait till the microphone is delivered to you, we may be able to hear you, but some of the room might not be able to, and we want to be sure you pick it up in the recording. So if you just raise your hand, we will have Derek come to you with a mic, and we'll throw it open to the floor.
Hi, yeah, my name is Mitchell. I'm a grad student in political science, PhD. My question for the panel is, what are our expectations, if we have any clear ones, about individual voter incentives within autocratic versus democratic elections? Because it seems to me that a lot of the assumptions that we kind of build up with, Duvergerian logics and so on and so forth are based on notions of strategic voting and the like. And I just wonder, can we think about strategic voting in an alternative way in autocratic systems?
You want to take a stab? Alberto? I'll go ahead and flip your mic on, yeah, if you will, just so they can pick it up.
Here, okay. I don't know that I have a good answer, but I think that the incentives are pretty similar, except that the voter reaction is very similar, except that the set of incentives sometimes differs, right? So it's not too hard to think that somebody's being strategic if they know that if they don't show up to vote, they're going to lose their job or be flagged or whatever, right? So you could call that strategic, but it's strategic in a trivial way. I think there is a lot of strategic, as what I was describing, the incentives that authoritarian elections provide, these outsized margins provide, is for strategic defections from the opposition and strategic allegiance to the ruling party. So I think that's a very strong incentive that exists in these systems.
Just going to add quickly to that. I can't see you, but I think there's also an element of strategy when it comes to the opposition's decision to boycott or not. So if the opposition decides to boycott, then they have no chance of getting seats. But if they participate in the contest, then they're legitimizing it. So I think that there's a little bit of a difference there because we're operating under this world where the result is not necessarily going to be honored.
I think, Alberto emphasized the importance of electoral fraud. And I think, it's very important, of course, in authoritarian regimes. And in addition to that, I think that, electoral systems are also manipulated in authoritarian regimes. And the looking at the gap between seats and votes distributions in electoral authoritarian regimes, so if you have SMD systems, then there is huge gap between seats and votes distributions, also in electoral authoritarian regimes. And this is what we see in advanced democracies, but we also see the same pattern in electoral authoritarian regimes. This may suggest that of course dictators can utilize the other electioning strategies like keeping high level of malapportionment or manipulating electoral districts to produce gerrymandering. But I think the other mechanism may be that voters may be cast their vote on ruling parties because ruling parties are very big compared to opposition parties, so that they may have some incentive to vote for ruling parties, because it is the relevant options. So that in so doing, it may be the case that the strategic voting comes about among voters in authoritarian regimes.
Carl?
Yeah, so I can add another slightly different point, because I also think there are several ways in which both voters and different parties can be strategic and think about different concerns. And one thing that's been discussed in the literature is the link between, so thinking of this more at the regional level, differences between different localities in the country. Are ruling parties punishing or rewarding different, say, municipalities or different parts of the country that voted largely in favor of the ruling party? And that's actually it's probably something that varies by the regime. Different regimes operate differently. But there are stories of how, for example, you try to express a signal of dissatisfaction, and this could be for particular regions. So you'd want to signal to the regime that you are dissatisfied. On the other hand, it's not really good if you're the only municipality, or maybe even if there are small precincts, if you're the only one that massively signal this change. So there could be all types of calculations going on, and then this would affect decisions both in terms of whether or not to show up to vote and also whom to vote for.
Okay, time for a few more questions. Derek, up here front.
It occurs to me that authoritarianism is a matter of degree insofar as one can characterize governments as being authoritarian or not. And I wonder whether the panelists all agree as to what the criteria should be, because for that matter, they're all shaking their heads. For that matter, the authoritarianism of a regime evolves over time in many cases. And so you might have regimes that are slipping in and out of the category. So how do you make this categorical generalization that you all seem to have made?
Maybe can I suggest that we talk both about the conceptual problem and then also maybe the measurement problem? You can address one or both of those. Maybe we'll go in reverse order this time.
Yeah, that's a tough question. But basically my take on the conceptual is that I fully agree. It's a graded. I think of democracy, autocracy as a graded scale, and then there are discussions on how many dimensions and which are the key criteria for learning the extent to which a country is democratic or autocratic, which is then the absence of democracy, the way I think about it, at least. Then I think so that's the conceptual part, and of course it's the same. It's the general philosophical problem of where to put a threshold on a continuous scale. So when does red turn into blue somewhere on the purple shaded part of the axis? But I think so for me, the main reason I do this in empirical work is basically like a shorthand. So I use it as a shorthand. So I talk about the regimes that are lacking in democracy, relatively speaking. And then there are all these wonderful data sets that, for example, the one that Erica has contributed to, that makes certain categorization. So the way I go about would then be to say, I think of this as shorthand. So I distinguish the measurement and the conceptualization issue, and then I look at whether or not the choice of threshold matters. So if different operationalizations makes the result look different.
You want to comment on that?
Yeah, so it's a very difficult question, and what I'm relying on is data sets, binary measure of democracy and autocracy, and here in the data sets, the emphasis is put on whether elections, free and fair elections bring government alternation through election results. So if there is any government alternation through free and fair elections, and opposition parties, the ruling parties admit that they lost those elections, then that regime is regarded as democracy. And so it's it's true that it's a really rough binary measure. But after distinguishing between democracy and autocracy with that binary measure, we can also see many differences within dictatorships. So some dictatorships hold no elections. And even some autocratic regimes hold elections, there may be no opposition parties. And so there are several steps that dictators need to make decision on how to design elections. So yeah, it's very difficult to distinguish between democracy and autocracies, but I think there are also kind of varieties of dictatorships in terms of designing of elections.
Alberto, any comment?
Yes. No, I mean, I fully agree. I would only add that in doing empirical work, there are so many possible reasonable ways to create a cutoff, either with a discrete measure or with a continuous measure, that it's incumbent upon anyone to just do robustness checks by saying, well, what if I assume that everybody who's has had turnover that's the deciding characteristic? What if I assume that that's not enough, but you need some other traits of liberal democracy? What if I draw the line at gerrymandering, right? Some people would think that elections in the US are very unfair because of campaign finance laws and gerrymandering. Now, of course, if you compare to the elections we're talking about, they do not look unfair. But if you are in the US, there's every reason to worry about the problems of the US and not, Yeah, that's what I have to say.
Erica?
I agree with pretty much everything you all were saying. I would say, so there are pretty heated debates over, the way that you should measure it, and I consistently say that the way that you measure it depends on the question that you're interested in. So a continuous measure is going to be very useful if you're interested in political liberalization. A binary measure cannot tell you much about that. A continuous measure can't tell you about autocratic to autocratic regime change. A binary one can. These are kind of details that are, boring for non-academics. But I think that there is quite a bit of consensus, more than we might think, about what democracy is. The threshold discussions are over very small differences. It's not a huge difference. And the focal point is usually about the election and whether it was free and fair. Where the disputes arise is, the categories of authoritarianism, whether it's a gradation or a reality or what have you. But, again, we're kind of moving in, it's undeniable that North Korea is a lot different than, say, Venezuela even, in terms of its autocraticness. And the extent to which that difference matters depends on what outcome you're interested in. So that's how I would close it out.
Excellent. Right up here, Sasha?
Thanks for this very interesting panel. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of subnational elections in these states, because obviously a lot of work's been done on elections in the executive, but a lot of authoritarian states also have elections for governors and things like that, and mayors in major cities, and then full on down the line. A lot of the theories we have about those are that you need to have elections to pick who's most loyal, who's the best at using fraud to show their loyalty, but they're largely about sort of what those offices can do for the president or the autocrat or whatever. But also, people in those offices need to be able to deliver good governance or some reasonably acceptable level of governance to people who live in their constituencies. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how elections can help solve that problem, if at all.
And we want to take a shot at that?
Go ahead. Yeah, I can try. I think that's I've seen a lot of interesting work very recently on subnational elections, and it's obvious that this is an area where I think we're going to have better answers for your question in 10 years, I hope, than we have at the moment. But I think so the fact that they're serving multiple purposes, I think everyone agrees on. So both for so it's both a way for the national level regime to handle issues with recruitment or training and differences between the regions, but of course I think to the extent that it has a function also locally, I think it's the same one that we're theorizing at national level, and it pertains to information. So the expression of dissatisfaction through abstention from voting, it could be voting for opposition parties. But probably also, I mean, the lower the scale, the more probably campaigning matters, if there is campaigning. So both in terms of distribution of goods related to these elections, but also tying constituencies to to local level politicians. So I think they serve multiple functions, both between the local level politicians and the national level, but also probably, as you indicate, between, for the population and the linkage to politics at the local level.
So there's two aspects that I would highlight. One of them is that this has to do with debates about centralization and what decentralization and what decentralization does. And on the one hand, one theory is that it brings the government closer to the people, so that then local accountability, that ends up shaping what local governments do. And another theory says that it devolves too much power to local thugs, and it reduces accountability. And I think both things happen. And so one can see that local level elections can suffer from the same kind of blights and display the same kind of variation that national level elections do. Of course, one can never forget that local elections are embedded in a national system, but that notwithstanding, so for example, one famous comparison compares like states of India. The state of Uttar Pradesh, for example, historically was very repressive, and one could say there was a strong, there was one-party rule for many years, and then the state of Kerala in the south had turnover and had the Communist Party rule at some points, and so on and so forth. And of course, public services and education and everything, except for economic growth, is better in Kerala than in many other states of India. And so, the argument has been made that this kind of political competition has improved public service provision. On the other hand, there are studies of local governments that do not show that the level of political competition is correlated with better public service provision. In my reading of the literature, that's a puzzle. Nobody really knows exactly why that might be the case, right? So, I mean, it's a very complex question. One is about political competition, and the other part is about the relationship between political competition and provision of good governance. And that's not a straightforward translation, even in the absence of fraud and manipulation.
Other questions?
Well, many thanks. This was great. Okay. So one concept that I noticed nobody mentioned in any of your presentations was competitive authoritarianism, which is probably the most cited, most used concept to describe what you guys are talking about. And so just to kind of put this on the table, so for Levitsky and Way, who wrote this massively cited book on competitive authoritarianism, like they draw a different distinction. So it's not just a distinction between democracies and authoritarian regimes, but that you should distinguish authoritarian regimes by whether they're, including electoral ones, whether those elections are basically competitive or whether it's still effectively closed. Like elections aren't really going to make the difference in who has power or not. And I'm just wondering, it means that, and they argue that how those regimes operate and break down is just different. Competitive authoritarian regimes are a subset of even electoral authoritarian regimes that are meaningful and different dynamics. And I just wonder if you guys buy that. I mean, does your research suggest that we should be drawing this distinction? Or basically is this something, it's an artifact of just some electoral authoritarian regimes might just be at a different moment than others? But is this a distinction that we should be using? Is it a meaningful one? Is it a helpful one? Or is it something we can kind of cast aside and just think more broadly about electoral authoritarian regimes?
Can I go?
Erica, ready to jump on that?
So I think I'm going to go back to it depends on what you're interested in, because there's research that shows that the competitive authoritarian regimes deliver better overall welfare levels consistent with our research than the solely electoral or the non-electoral. So there's some evidence that there are certain things that are better for places where you have competitive authoritarianism. Where I think that it's not that meaningful, the distinction has to do with when we're thinking about democratization and regime change. So, it depends on what the outcome is. And then the other thing that I find, I don't know, not troubling is not the right word, But we're moving to the situation where most places are competitive authoritarian. So then how are we able to understand these places in meaningful ways? If everything is kind of evolving into a similar end state, through autocratic learning or what have you, it makes me wonder, to what extent is this a meaningful line for disaggregating regimes?
Alberto?
So everybody draws, if the distinction between democracy and authoritarianism is contested, I think this one is, literally everybody does it different. And some people call closed authoritarian regimes those that do not hold elections, period. Or that hold, some other people call them those that hold elections, but there's only one party on the ballot. And other people, and Levitsky and Way, I think, are more subtle, but it's really very difficult to defend any distinction there. I mean, on the basis of what do you distinguish between a competitive and an uncompetitive authoritarian regime? If you look at margins of victory in the elections, well, those are shaped by things like the popularity of whoever is there, the economy, things that have nothing to do with the structure of the regime. So I haven't seen a satisfactory explanation of what are like the distinguishing structural traits of the regime that will tell you. I mean, it's very easy to say whether a regime is an electoral regime or not. If they hold elections, it is. If it's not, it's not. But
so in other words, you're saying that competitive authoritarianism is defining it by the outcome rather than by its
yes, I think
traits.
that's
Is that
largely the
okay.
case, despite like huge efforts not to do that by many scholars. Yeah.
Irene.
So this question is mostly for Carl, but maybe other people have some input as well. So your work found this destabilizing short-term effect for elections, but I'm wondering if you have any intuition about the effect of multiple elections. So I see like two possible stories. One would be that as some party or individual continues to win more and more elections, the electoral institution starts to lack legitimacy. But then the other one, if this is a signaling device, like some people have suggested, then maybe as one individual or party continues to win, the perception of their strength increases, or perhaps even their organizational capacity increases, like they learn essentially how to better rig the elections. So have you looked at this, or do you have any thoughts about what you would see?
So yeah, it's a very good question. So we have a quite lengthy appendix where we try to delve into some ways of so thinking about different theoretical mechanisms. How would we operationalize? How would we measure? Construct a measure to capture this long-term effect. So we're trying out different things. It's been a couple of years since I worked with the paper, so I don't remember the exact results, but I seem to remember that it's definitely stabilizing if you get past the first couple of elections. I don't know if that could be elections, but it could also be something more generic about the regime at that time. So we're trying to distinguish those, but of course it's hard statistically to do it. That being said, I think so the short-term effect, I think you could operate no matter which ones of the two scenarios that you're indicating is true. So you could still have peaks in probability for each and every election. So I'm not sure theoretically which one I expect would be strongest, but I think the results tend to point to the multiple elections being institutionalized. It tends to strengthen the regime, but it's hard to know whether that's just mixing together the time dimension. So I wouldn't dare say.
Let me exercise my prerogative as chair and ask the last question here. We've got a number of grad students in the audience who are thinking about dissertations. Or should be thinking about dissertations. So let me, Erica did this a little bit in her comments. Let me just put the question to the group. So what in your mind are some of the big remaining puzzles, questions, unresolved issues, remaining debates that need to be resolved? Or if you prefer, topics or questions that when you get a paper to review, you think not another paper on X? Where would you sort of where would you see the holes in the literature or the excesses in the current literature? start, Eric can move that this way.
I feel like I kind of showed my cards already. So I don't have anything new to add on that. I mean, I guess where I think things are kind of getting boring, I usually think the things that are boring are the things I'm working on. So to me, it's kind of boring that, you know, dictatorships are mimicking democracies, because I feel like I've just written about it too much.
It's a great question. I mean, I would just have to emphasize that embedded in your question is this idea that we sometimes know stuff that, you know, is established knowledge in the social sciences. It's something that I would probably not subscribe to. But I do think that as we get better and better data for subnational regions and more consistent data for the world, for subnational regions in many countries, there will be opportunities to learn something more about the dynamics of subnational regime type, quote unquote. That's one area. I don't know. I'll think a little bit more about it. I myself am not working on that anymore, so that tells you something.
Yeah. I would like to propose two things. The first one is that the literature could, you know, produce more papers about, you know, the relationship between, you know, different electioning strategies. So, you know, in my book project, I'm now working on the relationship between, you know, electoral manipulation and economic maneuvering. But even within, you know, those fraud and economic maneuvering, there are many variants about, you know, through which dictators can manipulate elections. So it may be important to explore the relationships among those different electioning strategies, so that you know, international society may be able to provide more precise, you know, prescription about how to make elections free and fair in dictatorships. And the second one is, it may be the case that dictators may be imitating the other dictators, you know, electioning strategies in the same region. So, for example, in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, the electoral systems are now, you know, PR systems. And I think it's very likely that you know, those countries mimicked electoral systems from, you know, from other countries, including Russia. So I think there are some diffusion mechanisms going on about how to manipulate elections, and also what kind of electoral systems a dictator adapts. So, this is about me, but in my book project, I'm looking at the, you know, domestic factors. So, and I did not see the spatial, you know, relationships across dictatorships. But you know, now the you know, the international diffusion of authoritarianism or, you know, democratic backsliding is, you know, getting really, really important issue. So authoritarian election literature maybe should also look at that aspect.
Carl.
So it was a really hard question to to end with. So, but luckily I'm last, so I had a chance to think. So I think that the last question pointed to something that I would like to see more of, and that's, so we have these theories of how, for example, autocratic elections work, or we have theories about how autocrats draw on different groups for support, and oftentimes we have competing or seemingly competing theories. But it's been really hard to test, and at other times we have theories predicting the exact same outcome. So it's really hard to know whether it's the informational aspect of elections that affect regime survival, or if it's a legitimacy aspect. I think we're getting to a point, both in terms of like methodological sophistication and the discipline, the amount of data we have, both at the subnational level, like different types of data, also cross-national measures that are more specific in what we're capturing. So to be able to allow us to drill down and look at mechanisms and test theories up against each other. So that would be my, like, take existing theories and see which one cashes out by testing, by being more original on the implications we test, and then just the net outcome.
Yeah, Carl.
If I may add to that, so Carl Henrik is one of the co-PIs on the VDEM project, which is one of the major cross-national data collection, the major cross-national data collection effort. And so for grad students, I think there's a lot to exploit there. And of course, the data set by, I'm surrounded by major data set creators here. These are really amazing public goods that people should exploit.
Excellent. Thank you all for coming. Would you please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for their thoughts and comments today?